just briefly introduce the next chair, which is Timotheus Vermeulen, and he is the Associate Professor at the Department of Media and Communication at this university.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Liv. Yes, I will introduce Mark Dorrian, which I think is a lovely honor and a bit of an intimidating honor. I'm going to say some stuff about your work, so hopefully you're not going to refute all of those things the second after. I've written a few notes down and I thought I'd read them up as a way of introducing our splendid speaker. A successful practicing architect and a scholar with a knack for high theory. A well-traveled public speaker with his ear close to the ground in Edinburgh. A keen critic and an exacting editor. On the board of more journals and committees than I could mention here. Though, to name drop just a few that I think are particularly impressive, the Architectural Theory Review, Critiques and Interstices. Professor Mark Dorrian is, as one commentator has put it, that rare thing, that rare bird, a rara avis. And I quote, a gifted experimentalist and a celebrated theoretician. Or, as another critic put it, and again I quote, Dorrian has the eye of an architect, the pen of a poet, and the toolkit of a skilled critical urbanist. I mean, you're going to live up to all of this. Mark Dorrian was trained as an architect in Edinburgh and London, with stints in the US and in Italy. In 1997, he co-founded the research design atelier Metis, which he still co-directs. A few years and various academic roles later, as it of course goes, he took up the Forbes Chair in Architecture at the University of Edinburgh. In his first role, as a joint director of Metis, he has exhibited urban and architectural proposals and installations worldwide. And I would say really worldwide, across the globe, from Beijing to Berlin, from Warsaw to Florence, New York and Prague. And his work was showcased at the Venice Biennial as well as at the Royal Academy of the Arts in London. The prestigious Rhodes School of Design devoted an exhibition to one of his projects, and in 2006 Metis was named as one of the top 25 emerging practices in Europe. The reason, however, I suspect, that my marvelous colleagues Liv and Jürgen, Susanne, Sune, Adam and Susanne, who we are to thank for this splendid event, have invited Mark Dorrian is the work that he has done in his second role, as a scholar/critic. Though he has written on a wide variety of topics and themes and tropes, ranging from, and this is I think quite wonderful, the monstrous and the grotesque, to the iconography of George IV, to colonial discourses in Ireland, to the image of military technology, to the cartographic imaginary, to representations of London, to Anthropocene architecture, to Anish Kapoor, to recently the theme of the Tartar in Elizabethan times. I think it's fair to say that the two strands of thinking and writing that are most pertinent to his present and talk here today are what we may call, this is dodgy, but what we may call spatial verticality and temporal verticality. And I mention them here hesitantly because I don't know if Mark would agree with those with that nomenclature, as well as separately, though of course each implies and indeed cannot be understood without the other. The first interest in spatial verticality has been worked through in numerous essays, some of which were reprinted in his critically acclaimed monograph, Writing on the Image, Architecture, the City, and the Politics of Representation, as well as the equally lauded collection that he edited with Frédéric Poussin, Seeing from Above, the aerial view in visual culture. Throughout these writings, Dorrian develops the notion of a space, the space of 19th and 20th and 21st century modernity, of industry and the machine age, of information and the network, that is measured both in its extraordinary events and in its everyday experience, in politically and economically, culture and the mind, along the lines of the vertical, of the way up and of the deep down. And if this sounds abstract, it isn't or isn't entirely, isn't exclusively. What Dorrian talks about are the processes that increasingly make us see, and consequently think, of ourselves and of the world in which we live from above, or indeed from below, or even within us. In any case, from a perspective that isn't ours, that doesn't align doesn't align naturally, you may say, with our body, but with the technologies of our past centuries, of airplanes and telelenses, of satellites and of Google Earth. The second strand of his research, pertinent to the presentation, I think, here today, indeed to a significant extent the topic of the talk, is what one may call a verticality of time, or what he calls in a forthcoming book written with John Beck, called Designing the Deep Future, Catastrophe, Containment and the Cultural Imagination, Deep Futures. The extent to which we as a society map out the likely and especially the unlikely routes that our reality may take in the long run. Routes that spread out from crossroads that are far less those of continuity than of the break, of the rupture, of the catastrophe. And how do we imagine futures past the point of imagination? Envisage a territory after the parameters of that territory have been swept and blown and exploded and eroded away. If the writing of Mark Dorrian on the verticality of space, of the aerial view and the vision from the tunnel, extends, you could say, our body into space, far beyond its corporal reality, then this project, I'm guessing, but also I'm wondering, and I'm thinking we'll hear about this, may just draw time into our body, preempting, preventing, opening up the future. The title of Mark's talk here today, I'm super happy to introduce him to you, is Archaeologies of the Future, on Crypts, Capsules and Catastrophe. The floor is yours, Mark.
Thank you, Tim, for that extremely kind introduction. It's all kind of vertically to the top. I think it's sort of all downhill from here. Yeah, please, yeah, switch over. So I was struck at the start by Liv saying that sort of characterising architectural geography as the kind of older sisters of media studies, and this has a slightly fairy tale-like connotation for me, as if media studies is the Cinderella, the Cinderella younger sister. But I really feel that today that the older sisters have been invited by Cinderella to come to the ball and enjoy this really sort of fantastic and interesting event. So in sort of thinking about what my contribution to this could be, I thought it would be interesting, as you know, Tim has implied or described in his talk, to sort of introduce the question of time and verticality, and I suppose this was something that was kind of in the background of my mind a little bit. In relationship to some of the work that you know, I'd done before on the cultural history of the aerial view, the cultural history of seeing from above, and I was struck sort of looking through that material that how frequently, whenever there are sort of cultural manifestations or setups which are about either seeing into the future or the past, these somehow are manifested through some spatial setup which involves some kind of vertical relation. I mean, in a way, this is already there in the etymology of the term prospect, which is certainly a term about seeing, a term that's linked to sort of conditions where one gets high into a high position to look, you know, to look forward, but also sort of early uses of the term linked to kind of seeing of the future as well, kind of a revelation of the future. So early occult representational devices, or magical mirrors, or occult forms of reflecting stones, were sort of described early as prospect mirrors, things that sort of looked forward into the future. I think we have sort of examples of this looking down or looking up, being kind of looking across time. We there are various sort of examples of that, I think, within in modernity that it's interesting to think about. So in a way, whenever, I think we see something of this whenever Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, talking about his experiences as a war pilot, talks about looking down through the crystalline glass of his cockpit, looking down at the battlefield below as if it was an earlier life form. We have something of this in Kazimir Maliewicz's description in the non-objective world of the suprematist abstraction as a kind of rising off the historical surface of the planet, a kind of departure from the world and its historicity, and looking back at that. We have something of this, I think, in Philip Morrison's narration for the Eames's film Powers of Ten, whenever we descend into the man's hand and we eventually reach the strands of DNA. And Morrison talks about seeing the genetic inheritance of the man. We have it in the earlier rough sketch, whenever the camera accelerates so much to the point that this is the Eames's 1968 film. The camera accelerates close to the point of light, and we have the dissonance between the two chronometers on the screen, one which is measuring Earth time, the other time at the point of observation. So this literally becomes a kind of time travel. We have it in various archaeological motifs, of course, where sort of going down is imagined to be a kind of passing through time. And the material I'm going to talk about today really sort of thinks about that, or thinks about one specific manifestation of that, or rather two, which are the twin time capsules that were buried side by side at the New York's World Fair site in Queens. So, as Tim said, this is sort of linked to some ongoing work. This is very much work in progress. And I want to mention my friend and colleague John Beck that this work has emerged in dialogue with. So to start this, I'm going to play you a couple of sort of movie clips from this film, The Middleton Family at the New York World's Fair. So this was a film that was produced by the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Corporation. This was the corporation that sponsored the time capsules, and I'm going to fill in these film clips. Set up a kind of context for what I'm going to say. I'm going to return to this. So it's I'd like us to sort of listen to the kind of audio track is important here, and I'm going to specifically return to that. This is an hour-long promotional film that was made as a kind of family drama. So here we go. Whoops. Let's try again.
The same number faced a similar problem last year. An equal number will face it next year. What chance have these boys and girls in a world already staked out? Now that the land from
Good morning, sir. Have a good sleep?
Will they find welcome or closed signs on the gateways of opportunity? What generation look forward to?
Wait a minute,
What
bud.
hope is there for youth in the world of tomorrow? The answers to these questions are vital to every man, woman, and child in the nation. They present grave problems to labor, commerce, agriculture, and industry. Their solution should be of primary concern to education and government for the quality of citizenship.
You're telling us.
The facts involved, however, are both difficult.
Sorry, Dad, I gotta do it. He's breaking my heart.
I should think you'd be interested in hearing about opportunities for young people.
What opportunities? Say, do you know the motto of the latest graduating class?
Something lofty, no doubt.
Yeah. WPA, here we come. That's super lofty.
Well, I guess times change. I remember when I was your age,
I know. You were working for a hardware job, and you kept right on until you saved enough to open your own store.
Yes, and I don't see...
Because times changed, like you said. We got all the hardware stores we need. And all the grocery stores, all the doctors, all the lawyers, all the gas stations, all the everything.
But it don't stand to reason that a country with our record could all at once lack openings for young fellas.
No, we just try and get a job.
Maybe it is difficult, but it's worse to be a quitter. Now you've got years of school ahead of you, yet you let your friends talk you into believing you're licked already.
They know what they're talking about.
Now listen, son.
Okay, that's the first clip. Now the second that I want to show you is where the family then go to the fair. This is the section where they visit the time capsule.
Time capsule of cupeloi, deposited on the site of the New York World's Fair on September 23rd, 1938, by the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. If anyone should come upon this capsule before the year AD 6939, let him not wantonly disturb it, for to do so would be to deprive the people of that era of the legacy here left them. Cherish it, therefore, in a safe place.
5,000 years from now, the peoples of the future will look back on us as we look back on the early Egyptians and Babylonians. The time capsule down there is actually a message from our time to theirs. Those who open and study it will know more about us than any man living today.
But Jim, how in the world do you know it will last so long?
Because the copper tools of the ancients have come down to us from even farther back. The capsule is made of a still better copper alloy called cupeloi. It's hard as steel and equal to pure copper and resistant to corrosion.
Well, what I'm wondering is how anybody will know how to find it in the year, what was it, 69, 39?
How to find it, what's in it, in fact, everything about it was printed in the book of record of the time capsule. It's on permanent paper and it's been distributed throughout the world. To libraries, museums, laboratories, monasteries, temples, every safe place imaginable.
Well, who picked the stuff that was to go in it, Jim?
A committee, aided by authorities in every field of science and the arts. It's a complete record of our civilization.
Is this exactly like the capsule?
Yes, and it's cut away so you can see how it's packed. These side cases show you the variety of things.
Here's the whole class.
The ladies haven't revealed a lot about us to future scientists.
They sure will. They'll think we're nuts.
Are these little reels the microfile?
Yes. It's hard to believe, but on these small reels of film are reproduced all these books, papers, and magazines. It's a record of 10 million words and 1,000 pictures.
So how will they read them?
A small microscope is included. But there are also instructions how to make a large reading machine. Also, how to make a motion picture projector with 3 special newsreels.
I suppose cloth and things like that are in it, too.
Everything from samples of fabrics to a dozen different kinds of common seeds.
I better nickel, I know something that isn't in it. Mickey Mouse.
Your Rosebud. Mickey Mouse, Dick Tracy, Barney Google, they're all there. Even toys and money. Why, the list of contents alone takes up 17 pages of fine print.
Boy, they weren't fooling when they made that capsule, were they?
It's the brains of the world done up in a small package. And it's the most permanent exhibit at the fair. It'll still be here when the rest of this place is nothing but dust.
That's real.
Okay, so So that sets the context a little bit. We owe the term time capsule to this man, G. Edward Pendray, publicist who joined the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company in 1936 as assistant to the president. Whenever Pendray was employed, he was charged with convincing the public, and his kind of mission, his stated task was to convince the public that the company was more forward-thinking than its rival General Electric. And as a result, the Westinghouse Company took a site at the 1939-40 New York World's Fair, which was then being planned in a former ash tip site in Queens that had been identified and rechristened Flushing Meadows by the New York Parks Commissioner Robert Moses. Now, developed for the fair with its Building the World of Tomorrow theme, Pendray's capsule would take its place amongst a number of exhibitionary installations that were staged as vehicles of both time travel and corporate promotion. Notable here was the extraordinary Futurama exhibit designed by Norman Bell Geddes for General Motors, technologically extending and reorientating the traditional diorama form. This transported visitors via a chain of mechanised moving seats that emitted a voice-over commentary from inbuilt speakers. As they travelled, the viewers passed over a series of models of varying scales from 1 to 1,200 to 1 to 600, which gave the impression of ascending and descending in an aircraft over a future United States of the 1960s. Now, this rhetorically converged the exhilaration and modernity of the aerial view with streamlined styling and the delineation of a national landscape restructured by mobilities, superhighways, etc. Located spectators not merely as remote viewers of the future, but actually, if momentarily, within it. Not only did visitors receive a badge that announced us in the future, but in a final coup de théâtre, at the end of the ride, they found themselves stepping into a full-scale reconstruction of a scene that they had just witnessed in miniature from above. The effect, as one visitor reported, was startling, as if you really had landed in the future while the illusion lasted. In a similar fashion, the Democracy exhibit of Henry Dreyfus, who was a one-time apprentice of Bell Geddes, gave visitors a synoptic aerial view. Installed within the vast globular perisphere, which with the needle-like three-sided trilon formed the symbolic centrepiece of the fair, Democracy was a gigantic miniature city set 100 years in the future, which visitors viewed from high revolving platforms set at 2 levels. So these were sort of moving circular galleries. The presentation included a projection onto the interior of the sphere, which you can see at the top of the illustration on the left-hand side, of characteristically attired workers marching toward the viewers. As they approached, they, as the official guidebook says, were seen to represent the various groups in modern society, all the elements, and quote, that must work together to make possible a better life, which would flourish in such a city as lies below. The 1939-40 New York's World Fair, with its insistent and optimistic futurism, has been understood as the apotheosis of the US Depression-era expositions. These were events underpinned, as Robert Bennett notes, by deeply entrenched commitments to scientific rationality, technological progress, modernist aesthetics, industrial design, increasing consumer prosperity, and a highly positive view of corporate capitalism, end quote. And while in many ways the Westinghouse time capsule was fully compliant with all of this, at the same time, through its fundamental programmatic conceit of transmitting a record of contemporary civilization into a far distant future, it put in play a series of representational dilemmas and effects that troubled the more straightforwardly positive future visions that were in evidence at the fair. Now, certainly the time capsule appeared as an emblematically modern object. Shaped in Pendray's description like a torpedo, it was slim, smooth, gleaming, with its tapering ends streamlined. A missive targeted a 5,000-year future date, whose technology of the future, might already be imagined to anticipate. In the publicity information produced for the sister vessel that would come to be buried alongside it in 1964, the very metallic luminescence itself takes on symbolic value. Shining proof, as the brochure wrote, that man endures and indeed prevails. The shell of the 1939 capsule, which you see here, was cast from an anti-corrosive copper alloy. It's 99.4% copper, 0.5 chromium, 1.1% silver, developed by Westinghouse and enshrined in the official name, the time capsule of Kupoloi. The interment of the device took place at noon on the 23rd of September 1938, at the precise moment, according to the publicity material, of the autumnal equinox. In the 50-foot deep silo in the Westinghouse side, which is christened alternately the Immortal Well, as we saw in the film clip a moment ago, or the Well of the Future, there it remained visible via a periscope mechanism until the fair closed, when the well was finally sealed. Now, prior to joining Westinghouse, Pendray had worked as a journalist and editor, displaying a keen interest in projectiles, both aerial and subterranean, in his various activities. In 1929, when he was currently on the staff of the New York Herald Tribune, he had published a science fiction novel entitled The Earth Tube under the pen name pseudonym Gavin Edwards. In this, an enigmatic, sort of pseudo-Mongolian Asiatic horde conquer and enslave China and Japan, closing the east again to Western ideas of commerce. The Asiatics go on to mount an invasion of the West by drilling a huge tube through the centre of the Earth, stretching from an artificial island off the coast of Japan to one lying near the southern coast of South America. Now, through this, in Pendray's book, hurtles a strangely time-capsule-like vehicle, which, although gigantic, is described as bullet-shaped and tapered at both ends, and is made of a mysterious metal alloy, by virtue of whose prodigious capacities the Asiatics have made their conquests. In the plot of the story, South America becomes it's a kind of malign, militarized geoengineering. South America becomes flooded with water. Conversely, the Asiatics, in their control of metallic substances, they flood the US with gold, which they cascade down upon the nation in an effort to undermine its private enterprise economy and provoke a totalitarian socialism. The year following the publication of The Earth Tube, Pendray became one of the founder members of the American Interplanetary Society, a group that grew up around a circle of contributors to publisher Hugo Gernsback's science fiction magazine, Science Wonder Stories. I think this is something that's notable in this particular cultural history, that in a way the homegrown American sort of rocket program, as it were, develops out of science fiction speculation. It's very, very closely tied to science fiction imaginaries. David Lasser, who was the editor of Science Wonder Stories, was himself a science fiction writer, and was the author of the influential non-fiction The Conquest of Space. In 1931, became the first president of the American Interplanetary Society, and Pendray himself succeeded him in 1932. The previous year, 1931, Pendray and his wife Lee had visited Europe, where they met members of the VFR, the Society for Space Travel, who were experimenting in Berlin, who were experimenting with liquid fuel rockets. Pendray visited the Flugplatz, the rocket port that had recently been established in Berlin. On Pendray's return, the Interplanetary Society became involved in building and testing small liquid fuel rockets. The first trial, in November 1931, failed, but the second, launched by Pendray and his associate Rick Smith from Grit-Kills Park, Staten Island, for a public audience in May 1933, successfully lifted off and rose to 250 feet before the oxygen tank ruptured, bringing it back to Earth. So kind of a film record of this launch.
25 years ago today, a generation passed, but containing the seeds of the present. On Staten Island, the world's first liquid fuel rocket was ready for launching by G. Edward Pendray of the the American Interplanetary Society. Rocketry in those days was carried on by amateurs, without aid from government or industry. This 7.5-foot missile, powered by gasoline and liquid oxygen, gets off beautifully. Mid-flight, the fuel chamber overheated and exploded. Said the builders, the explosion actually would help improve the next one. Familiar sounding word.
In 1934, reflecting its shift from this sort of visionary science fiction roots, the society altered its name to the more sober-sounding American Rocket Society. Now, while the term time capsule was Pendray's, the idea had clear antecedents, such as the two safes associated with the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. The first of these is the Civil War widow's safe, Dime's Century safe, here, and photographer Charles D. Mosher's Memorial safe, which are both planned for opening at the US Bicentennial in 1976. Intended by the progenitors to remain visible to public view, so these weren't buried. They said the intention was that they sat in public buildings. With these early examples, no efforts were made. Nick Yablon writes. Yablon has done some important work on this. So no efforts were made to keep the vessels fully sealed or their contents concealed until their target date. Closer to hand and of direct significance for the Westinghouse time capsule was the Crypt of Civilization project, which was initiated in 1935 by Dr. Thornwell Jacobs, president of Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. Now, this crypt, which has been described as both the first millennia-spanning, deliberately targeted repository project, and also the first microcosm time capsule in the sense that it tries to interiorize kind of some sort of cultural totality, which then secures for the future. This project had decidedly Egyptological associations, partly inspired by post-World War I archaeological discoveries, in particular the 1922 opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun with its array of quotidian utensils. The Oglethorpe crypt took the form of a massively constructed cell, 20 feet long by 10 feet wide, within which the selected artifacts were secreted. As with the Centennial safes, it projected its target date forward from an originary reference point, such as the time of sealing would come to be the historical midpoint. Far from a modest century, however, the reference date was now dialed back to 4241 BCE, the earliest recorded date in ancient Egyptian records, and the one assumed by the historian Edward Mayer to represent the starting point of the Egyptian civil calendar. This consequently pushed the crypt's target date to the deep future point of 8113 CE, Christian era. Pendray was familiar with the Oglethorpe crypt. He seems to have been the author of a short piece in the project in the Literary Digest of October 1936, which appeared a month before Jacobs' own article on the crypt was published in Scientific American. Indeed, Jacobs records in a diary entry that he visited Pendray in September 1938, while the latter was working on the Westinghouse time capsule. And this, while the Westinghouse capsule is usually thought in relation to its double, to its 1964 double, the original, the 1939 device was already, in a sense, a reenactment and futurist re-envisioning of the Oglethorpe crypt, even if the latter would not finally be sealed until after the Westinghouse capsule. Where the Crypt of Civilization was an archive dedicated to the future that was organised around a deeply historicising motif, the rocketeer Pendray, in taking up the idea, stripped away its dusty necrological associations, resituated it as a high-technology, rocket-age time machine with an airtight and atmospherically conditioned payload aimed at AD 6939. Perhaps not coincidentally, at 7 feet 6 inches long, the time capsule turned out to be the same dimension and proportion as the American Interplanetary Society rocket that Pendray had launched from Staten Island. Apparently before the name time capsule was decided upon, time bomb had been first considered. Now, in this discussion of the century chest developed by the another century chess project developed by the financier Louis Erich in 1901, Nick Yablon has suggested that the notion of the time capsule as microcosm, as a kind of total interiorization, emerges in relation to an ideational horizon of impending catastrophe. At the Erich chest, he writes, anticipations of social rupture evidently generated a corresponding rupture in the epistemological function of the time vessel. Now the vessel becomes more ark-like, it has to be sealed, it has to protect its civilizational contents. Within the conceptual frame of the time capsule's microcosm, the aspiration becomes to encapsulate present totality, however that is construed, and to convey it to the other side of the catastrophe, whose presence to come forms the motivating rationale for the project. And here the Westinghouse time capsule comes into focus as different in kind than those other time machines that proliferated in the 1939 to 40 fair. First, the conceit of the latter was to install the future in the present, and thereby occlude or avoid the question of the transition between the two, or at least to dissolve it in sublimated representations of labour, a la democracy. The programmatic intention of the time capsule was to project the present into the future in an act of proleptic memorialisation that depended upon, however elided, suppressed and qualified it might have been, a larger narrative of loss. As Eduardo Cadavas noted in a different, although related context, any collective or political programme motivated by a will to absolute and eternal imminence is organised around the production of death. Commenting on the emergence of millennia-spanning time capsules in the 20th century, the historian of time capsules, William Jarvis, has characterised them as, I quote, a zenith, a celebration in the history of human civilization, and has noted that their contents tend to be vast, encyclopedic in scope. Generally, the time capsule's scope of deposited contents is directly proportional to the targeted date span. End of quote. Now, certainly, in a sense, they are celebrations. The Westinghouse capsules are celebrations, and this is closely linked to their typical topoi affairs. But another way of narrating this is to recognise, following Yablon, the time capsules become microcosmic or encyclopedic when they enter the catastrophist phase. Their deep future projections are part and parcel of this. The appearance of these in the 20th century is undoubtedly closely tied to the evolution of radically destructive capacities and technologies, whose related forms the capsules themselves come to mimic. Now time capsules no longer sit in public display or are permeable to the present, but go deep underground like the Westinghouse capsule, or become bunker-like installations such as the Oglethorpe Crypt with its 7-foot thick stone roof. Now, this ambivalence deeply marks the various productions around the 1939 Westinghouse capsule, such as the Book of Record of the time capsule of Kupoloi, which is described in the book as, which Pendray wrote, as our message to the archaeologists of the future. Now, this slim book, which is part apologia, part inventory, part interpretive guide, and part manual for locating and extracting the time capsule, acted as a kind of unavoidable supplement, an artifact necessarily outside the secure interior of the capsule that was charged with remembering on the surface the subterranean memorial object below. In effect, the capsule was committed to the protection of the Book of Records, placed under the protection of this book, which itself consequently had to be without protection. Or rather, that protection was displaced. But to this end, copies of the Book of Record, and 3,650 were produced, were distributed to various archives, seemingly including Tibetan lamasseries for safekeeping. The logic of the move was thus to presuppose the survival, in however degraded form, of the protective archives, on whose destruction the very rationale of the capsule was predicated. If proper care was provided, we're told, or at least preceding archivists were told, the printed Book of Record was capable of lasting the 5,000 years to the target date of the capsule itself. If the Book of Record survived, it presumably did so thanks to the continuing integrity of the archive, within which the kind of cultural documentation that the capsule was designed to transmit was already incorporated. And if it did not, and the capsule did turn out to be the kind of singular carrier of its cultural payload that its creators imagined, then it became temporarily unmoored, left to the vagaries of chance. And in the last instance, what Penry optimistically described as the digging and burrowing habits of the human race. Now, while the Book of Records suggested at the outset that, I quote, in our day it's difficult to conceive of a future less happy, less civilized than our own, this prognosis was immediately qualified by admissions of contingency and intimations of ruin, destruction and decay. Thus the anticipation that those in the future, quote, will be able to reconstruct through archaeological techniques the hard structures of our culture, our architecture, our dams and roads, our houses, our general physical appearance is indicated by our skeletons. This is a quotation from the Book of Record. In the promotional 1 hour long film made for Westinghouse, the clip of which you just saw, the Middleton family at the New York World's Fair, the family son, this is actually the end of the second clip we showed. The family son at one point says to the young electrical engineer who's acting as the viewer's guide, says, boy, they weren't fooling when they made that capsule, were they? The reply, it's the brains of the world done up in a small package, and it's the most permanent exhibit of the fair. It'll still be here when the rest of this place is nothing but dust. The response is delivered in the typically cheerful but instructive tone. But the equivocality of what this place means here makes us pause. Is it the Westinghouse Pavilion, the fairgrounds, Queens, New York, the continent, or even the earth? Moreover, the Book of Records' opening gambit regarding the difficulty of imagining a degraded future was hardly borne out by the commentaries of the 3 noted men, 2 of whom were recent emigres from Nazi Germany, whose messages to those to come concluded the Book of Record. These were, at best, only weakly affirmative of the future. For the physicist Robert A. Millikan, the danger was that the time capsule might in effect find itself travelling in reverse, that is, into a future of atavistic despotism. For his part, the author Thomas Mann foresaw not progress, but only the eternal, by implication futile, repetition of attempts, quote, on the part of man to approximate to his idea of himself. And finally, Albert Einstein briefly praised technological progress before lamenting the conflict-inducing iniquities of the system of production and distribution of commodities. Under such arrangements, which he attributed to the low, as he put it, the low intelligence and character of the masses, the future could only appear fearful. His message to the inhabitants of the future could only conclude with the tenuous hope that they would look back on the predicament of the present with a feeling of proud and justified superiority. The ambivalences that attended the Westinghouse time capsule are equally evident in the curious burial rites, which oscillated strangely between works of celebration and mourning, a complex nexus of transcendence and loss. As Jarvis points out, there were repeated sealing events, which, no doubt, the repetition, no doubt, driven by the publicity value. The first of these took place on the 16th of September 1938, when the capsule's inner glass tube, as Penry wrote, the Pyrex in a crypt, was filled with nitrogen and sealed. Next, the capsule was interred on the World's Fair site. The description from the story of the time capsule, another book that was produced at the time, is worth quoting at length. It was lowered 50 feet into the earth on the site of the Westinghouse building at the grounds of the World's Fair at high noon, September the 23rd, 1938, the precise moment of the autumnal equinox. While a Chinese gong tolled solemnly, A.W. Robertson, chairman of the board of the Westinghouse Electrical Manufacturing Company, committed the time capsule to posterity with these words: "May the time capsule sleep well. When it is reawakened 5,000 years from now, may its contents be found a suitable gift to our far-off descendants." Now, following this, it still remained possible to see the sunken time capsule, as we saw, for the duration of the fair via a viewing device, until at last the well was closed at its end. The ceremony that marked this final sealing was deeply funereal. Time magazine reported it this way: quote, "For 2 years, fairgoers have gaped at the capsule gleaming at the bottom of its open well. One day this week, on the stroke of noon, the well was sealed. A crowd of spectators bowed their heads. The bugle sounded taps. The capsule started its long journey through time. End of quote. Now, the character of these rites suggests that the capsules might be considered a manifestation of what Jacques Derrida has called survivance, which he described as the moment of survival at the very heart of life. Now, Derrida discusses this in the context of cultural forms and rituals that work to limit the reality of individual death, to soften or deaden it within the realm of the symbolic. With the time capsule, it's as if the cultural present enacts its own symbolic funeral rites under the shadow of what becomes a perpetually imminent catastrophe that the millennial deep time target, in a sense, guarantees. Distinct from historical forms of cultural or national memorialization, such as pantheons, that are accumulative and that presuppose the continuity of cultural memory, the millennial time capsule addresses precisely the breakdown or rupture of cultural memory, which is why it then expends such efforts in trying to establish the conditions for its belated reconstruction. This fantasy of reanimation or even resurrection is what will limit the reality of the impending death to come, and consequently confers upon the capsule the celebratory, euphoric aspect of historical transcendence that is the other side of its deathliness. And it is what determines the metaphorics of sleeping and waiting that are so much in evidence in contemporary discourses around the device, such as the epigraph drawn from the biblical book of Job, placed at the beginning of the book of Record. All the days of my appointed time I will wait till my change come. Thou shalt call and I will answer thee. An alarm clock, tooth powder, bifocals, an asbestos shingle, 838 issue of Harper's Magazine, a zippered tobacco pouch, beetleware, carrots, and a Miami fashion show. Tranquilizers, one checkered bikini, credit cards, a 50-star American flag, Tektite, Beatles record A Hard Day's Night, birth control pills, plastic wrap, material from Echo 2 satellite, Kent filter cigarettes, detergent, freeze-dried foods, irradiated seeds, plastic heart valve, an electric toothbrush, and desalted Pacific Ocean water. These lists are still visible today in the World's Fair site in Queens, embedded in mosaic, and the two circular panels that mark the positions of the 1939 time capsule and its supplemental twin. The reader is also told that the first capsule holds 22,000 pages of microfilm, 15 minutes of newsreel, and in total 124 items of common use, while the second adds to this with an extra 50,000 microfilm pages together with the named objects. What strikes the visitor most of all, however, is the strangeness of the lists, which the texts on the panels so symptomatically and emphatically foreground. The effect is to endow what appears to be the entirely banal with a magical or incantatory quality, the asyntactical sequence of seemingly unrelated names, suggesting a kind of recitation of the objects of consumer society at the two historical points. And as this is no logical or necessary beginning, middle or close, it gains an ideological inflection as a discourse on the plenitude, one thing after another, incessantly promised by private enterprise and capitalism. Certainly the geopolitics of this issue was in the thoughts of Robert Moses, now returned as president of the New York World's Fair Corporation, when he spoke at the groundbreaking ceremony of the Cold War era capsule in June 1933. So Moses described the fair as a sort of Olympics of progress, and asserted for Moses the key areas were the industrial and transportation areas. And he insisted the thing that impresses foreigners most are our achievements made possible through our private enterprise system. But already this kind of thematic was also present, as we'll see in a moment in more detail, in the Depression period futurism of the Westinghouse exhibit in 1939. In his well-known introduction to the Order of Things, which we talked a little bit about in the text session yesterday, Michel Foucault draws his well-known distinction between utopias and what he describes as heterotopias. As with utopia, in Foucault's words, permits fables and discourse, runs with the very grain of language. Utopia is a part of the fundamental dimension of fabula. The latter, heterotopias, he writes, quote, are disturbing because they destroy syntax in advance. Now, if thought in terms of this opposition, the programmatic aim of the time capsule was utopian coherence, that is, the effort to project their cargo into the future in such a way that the identities and relations of the various elements contained could be recovered and constructed, their outcome, through the extraction and isolation of the contents from their specific cultural context, was to fracture or sever syntactical positionality and thereby create an effect of heterotopic cut-up. It was as if the time capsules, in anticipating catastrophe, perversely produced it in advance in the very act of guarding against it. Certainly the way in which the acquisitive and exhibitionary culture of modernity fractured space and time had been evident since the 19th century, together with the related discourse on the fate of displaced and homeless objects. But the expanded temporality, symbolic agenda, and operative parameters of the capsules, which were in effect exhibitionary time machines, pushed the attendant issues to new heights. In Foucauldian terms, the intention of the Book of Record was to facilitate the reconstruction of the tabular ground, which would allow the reintegration of the scattered elements, texts, objects, and technologies contained in the capsules. In itself, Penbray wrote, the key to the English language, which is a section in the Book of Record, is believed to contain all the elements archaeologists of the future will need to translate and produce 1938 English. But this seemed to ally the central question of the conditions and limits of the far future legibility of the Book of Record itself, both its texts and images. And even though the Book of Record was necessarily positioned in an exterior, even transcendental relation to the capsule contents, the fact that a copy of the Book of Record was placed within the capsule was one of only two non-microfilm books, the other being the Bible. This emplacement in the capsule seemed an allegory of its fatedness to, in the end, take its place as just another one of the sequence of heterotopic elements contained within it. At the same time, as indicated earlier, it's important to note how the outcome of the curatorship of the capsules intersects with the logic of the cut-up, as it is already imminent in mid-20th century capitalist society, with its conditions of overproduction, need for constant stimulation of consumer desire, and accelerating informational forms. I think an interesting, symptomatic, an interesting demonstration of this is the comment of the sculptor William Turnbull, who was a member of the independent group of the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London. They sort of grouped the independent group and included figures like Peter Nelson-Smithson, Rainer Banham, Eduardo Palazzi, etc. They were eager receivers of kind of American cultural objects, advertisements, magazines, etc. in the 1950s. Reflecting on this period, Turnbull wrote that American magazines were an incredible way, quote, of randomizing one's thinking. One thing the independent group was interested in was breaking down logical thinking. He says, food on one page, pyramids in the desert on the next, a good-looking girl on the next. They were like collages. Now, such interest nourished projects such as the 1957 proto-cut-up for a new novel by J.G. Ballard, a writer certain in the orbit of the independent group. Using texts cut from scientific journals and graphic notational forms such as arrows, the new novel's pages were intended to be sequentially affixed to roadside billboards where they would be read at speed from vehicles. If the seeming arbitrariness of the objects interred in the capsules and recited in the memorial inscriptions gestures toward the logical interminability of the list, and hence to the plenitude of commodities promised by or circulating within capitalist society, then at the same time their very ephemerality becomes emblematic of consumption and the power to resupply, to transcend shortage through private initiative, technical innovation and capacity. It's therefore unsurprising how the contents of the time capsule, conceived as pieces of instant archaeology as they were described at the time, instant archaeology of their age, contrived to give people of the distant future a picture of us in our times. It's unsurprising that they start to look like the displaced detritus found in those most extreme cases of heterotopic cut-ups, garbage tips. At this point, the newly elevated identity of the World's Fair site as Flushing Meadows seems to come into curious alignment with its old repressed prehistory as the Corona Dumps ash tip site. Already in 1939, the Westinghouse exhibit anticipated the geopolitical battle lines that would be drawn up around the technological consumer product in the American National Exhibition in Moscow that took place 20 years later. Well known, of course, as the site of the so-called kitchen debate between the then US President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In the Westinghouse Pavilion, domestic appliances were presented under the heading Freedom, and the emancipated life that they promised contrasted with that of the high-browed Mrs. Rudge. This is a this is kind of dishwashing competition between Mrs. Modern on the left-hand side, Mrs. Rudge on the right-hand side, and Mrs. Modern with her Westinghouse dishwasher. It's with kind of sporting commentator who kind of stands in the middle and talks about who's in the lead. And of course, he finishes with, well, in the end, Mrs. Modern looks better than Mrs. Drudge because Mrs. Drudge has become dishevelled by the effort of the washing machine. However, it's clear that the connotations of the freedom declared here extended beyond the liberation of the housewife to a more general sense of political and market freedoms. And nowhere is this more visible than in the Westinghouse's film The Middleton Family at the New York World's Fair, in which the kind of socialist-fueled anxieties evident in Pendry's The Earth Tube, the science fiction novel, become reconfigured as a family drama. Right from the beginning of the film, it's clear that what is at stake is the future, and indeed the future of the family as it is entwined with the future and productivity of the nation as a whole. At the outset, as we saw, as a prelude to visiting the world of tomorrow, the fair, we find the father listening to a radio broadcast about future job prospects. What chance have these boys and girls in a world already staked out, where they find welcome or closed signs in the gateways of opportunity? His son is disinterested, but this will soon be set to rights by the experience of the fair. More difficult is the family's daughter, who is attached to her anti-capitalist bohemian artist boyfriend, with the suspiciously Soviet-sounding name of Markov. This then sets the stage for a sequence of ideological contestations with a handsome, assured Westinghouse engineer who accompanies the family around the exhibits, expounding the benefits of the technologies in show. In the end, the virtuous young engineer overcomes the cynical artist, who is revealed to be a coward, and he takes fright and bolts at the innocuous bang from the boys' firecracker matches. In the fable, the engineer, who is both an embodiment and personification of the company, thus acts to save both the future of the nation through technological and manufacturing prowess, but also the future of the family through his replacement of the sinister socialist and the affections of the daughter. As the new couple stand in the forecourt of the Westinghouse Pavilion, watching a nighttime light show playing in the sculpture beside the time capsule's well of the future, the engineer declares, "Why, all this is merely a sample of the world of tomorrow."
I've got to talk.
Please, dear, not now. Just let me hold on to you. I wonder if the years ahead will be as bad as this.
We haven't seen anything yet, darling. Well, this is merely a sample of the real world of tomorrow.
That's the end.
Here. Okay, thanks so very much, Mark, for that fascinating talk with a lovely ending also. I think we could talk about that particular scene for hours. I have like 5 or 6 or 7 questions I think I could ask about different things. I mean, is the name of the engineer, did I see that correctly? Is it Jim Treadway?
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Treadwell.
Yeah.
Even better. Yeah. Could I just, is it okay if I ask the first question? Is everyone okay with this? Could I ask something about this? Because the final scene, did she say to him, is the future really as
bright as this?
As bright? Because I wasn't sure if she said as dark as this or as bright. Because the entire, I mean, the aesthetics were the aesthetics of film noir, of course. And everything going up in flames reminded me strangely of like a Leni Riefenstahl film. So it was a wonderful. Could you expand on the aesthetics of that last scene? Also, I think in relation to your argument, the central point of your argument, and this duality and sort of schizophrenia, and captured within the time capsule as well.
Well, I think one of the things that's important at the last in the stage is that the separation from the couple from the family is important. So the family the family groups sort of looking up to the elevated position of the couple is in a way looking into the future of this is the future of the family. This is the kind of genealogy of the future reproduction of the family is kind of wrapped in to the this is the reproduction of the nature through the company, through the technological, the corporation is the mediator, as it were, between the family group and between the nation. And so I think in a sense this sort of comes back to the kind of visual orientation of the sort of looking into the future is always in a way, the future vision is always operable in a sort of mediated through a vertical relationship when either the Futurama exhibit, etc., sort of look down through the grand modernity of the elevated view or of the airplane view, or the Democracy exhibit, and something like this, I think, is being reproduced again in the last in the last scene. I think also the film itself doesn't sort of operate throughout through some kind of film noir aesthetic. I mean, the darkness at the end is about the close of the day at the fair, in which not so much the family has an epiphany, but the younger generation are transformed by the experience of the fair. So the boy who we saw at the start is interested in the future, or is at least kind of fatalistic in relation to the future. Is galvanized through the exhibition installations and the future visions that are put forward, whereas the daughter is in a sense saved and emancipated through the events of the day. So the darkness of the closing scene, I think, is very much about the.
Because it was so palpable when we started this sort of sitcom setup, right? There was almost no shadow. Like it seems almost like an effacement of shadows, and the light had a kind of flatness. And here, I mean, we look up at them, but we look up at them, and the shadows behind us.
No, I think it's I need to think some more about that. I'm not sure about the sort of Fritz Lang steps in at the end.
Yes, it did seem like that. It seemed like a nice sort of repeating of the argument you're also making about the catastrophe implied by the very shelling of the capsule or time bomb. Pity they didn't call it time bomb.
Yes.
Okay, wait, I want to open it up before I go on. Any questions from the room at this stage? Yes?
Hi, I'm Stefan from Sweden. Thank you for this. I was just wondering about, do you think there's a significant fact regarding the context that the word fair as an institution exhibition was sort of determined to disappear? The fact that they are temporary, these exhibitions. So there's some sort of dialectic going on with this context.
Yeah.
Or unless.
Yeah, I think so I suppose one of the characteristic things about fairgrounds is that there are, yes, they disappear, but there are strange permanencies as well that that remain. In one sense, the ephemerality of the fair, the temporality of the fair is used to dramatise the deep endurance of the time capsules. So in the film, we see the time. It's the most permanent exhibit of the fair, and it'll still be here when all this is dust. I think we talked about that. I think also, the fairs are. They become complex sites in which different sort of visions of the future are rehearsed, but also I think public constituencies made, constructed to receive those futures. So with the fairs and the exhibition setups of the fairs are sort of highly driven by sort of corporate commercial interests as well. So Futurama was was sponsored by General Motors. It envisaged a future for the nation in which superhighways and hence car production was absolutely central. These visions of the future are constantly inflected by the agendas of the exhibitors. But there are strange things about fair sites. I think they form strange permanences within cities as well. It's obviously classic examples like the Paris Tower, even on the New York side, the globe that was made for the steel globe that was made for the 1964-5 fair, or the mosaic panels. Even in one thinks of even a city like London, many of the key elements in the South Bank actually derived directly from the Festival of Britain exhibition. So I think it's complex. The conditions of survival developments from fairs are quite patterned, I think.
In terms of this context, these fairs, of course, typical 20th century phenomenon. They produce, in this case, these kinds of time bombs, these time capsules, which, as you've explained, I think wonderfully, are these weird kinds of things, especially with the manual, which is stored in the libraries, which supposedly will be destroyed, and so the manual for where this is lying is gone. How does it compare to? Are there similar kind of projects of archaeology of the future, whether state-sponsored or corporately funded, in the same time that you could compare these time capsules with, and do they have the similar kind of weird schizophrenic structure in them?
Yeah, I think the westernized ones are particularly interesting, I think, and draw together it seems to me anyway, a very good material, the materials so sort of complex in a way. They are, there are a moment at which the time capsule sort of shifts from being to being a high technology artifact in a way, and I suppose that it leads sort of direct. Obviously, there's been a more recent history of time capsule-like memorial records being projected into space, and people like Carl Carl Sagan, for example, involved with Trevor Paglen recently in the Last Pictures project. Certainly with Paglen's project, the Last Pictures is again a kind of it works within a kind of catastrophe sensibility, which I think really becomes. I think in a way it's there in the Oglethorpe Crypt, but I think it really becomes explicit in the Westinghouse Capsules. So yeah, the idea, of course, obviously the microcosmic capsule shifts the motif into an arc-like condition where the capsule becomes protected interior from which something can be repopulated or something can be reconstructed. So it's what survives into a post-catastrophic condition, and then there's some sort of imagined reanimation of the content of the content. So I think even things like isn't the seed bank, the genetic seed bank, is in Norway. Yeah. So sure, people here know much more about this than I do, but in a sense, the seed bank is, in a certain sense, a microcosmic time capsule, which works within a catastrophic horizon. Maybe people would like to talk about that.
Is the seed bank also bunkered? Because of course the other project is a flowing project, it's a mobile project in a way, mobile memory. Is the seed bank is a
kind of it's inside a mountain.
Of course it is.
In Svalbard.
Sorry?
In Svalbard.
It's metaphoric there, all right?
It's Berlin.
Okay.
You're like, okay.
But
yes.
but I mean, presumably the location of that is linked to some anticipation of what gets destroyed, given certain predictable. Yeah. So there's a kind of so it's not just that so it gets located in the.
But not just the world, but also species. I mean, we're losing the amount of species there will be.
Yes.
Every species should be sort of seed species.
But I was meaning the choice of location of the seed bank itself is linked to certain catastrophic scenarios.
Yes.
Did you have a chance to have the longer lists about what would be preserved? Do you have access to any archival files that tell us about the decision making and the distillation of these items, the selection of these particular items? I want to see like a broader repertoire of possibilities, like the kinds of conversations. And then at the same time, the list somehow seems so utterly appropriate.
Yes, there is. I mean, that's quite well. That's quite well documented. All material that is on the microfilm, etc. in the time capsule. The company put together a kind of board, a committee to consult on what should go into the capsule. So they were sort of Harvard-based anthropologists, etc. I can't remember specifically the constitution of the committee, but there are. At the same time, there are very clear privileges extended. So the American Constitution is there, and then there are summaries of other national constitutions. But the entirety of the American flag is in it. So the 1964 flag capsule starts to look like in a way, starts to look like a certain kind of colonization of the future through the text of the American Constitution, through the American flag. It's only a number of years later that the American flag is planted on the moon. It becomes, in a sense, sort of a missile sent through time, but with a certain, with an anticipation that. I think that the content will make some claim upon the future, or will make some effective claim upon the future. But the Book of Record, it's not the Book of Record actually contains a list of all material. The Bible is there, so it's the Bible and the Book of Record are the only two hard copy. Everything else is in microfilm.
In other words, a very ideologically unproblematic project. Is there a record of I mean, maybe I should ask this question, how many books of records are still in
Well,
existence?
how did they survive? That's an interesting question, and I don't know. I just don't know. So there's one. I work for one that is in the National Library of Scotland. So the National Library of Scotland is the copyright deposit library in Scotland. So every there's a legal requirement to deposit any publication that is certainly published in the UK. So there's quite a major collection, and one copy was sent to the National Library of Scotland. So there's a very interesting letter, which is a directive to the archivist, which is pasted into the interior of the book, which is almost. I mean, if the book of record is a manual in a way for the time capsule, including how to find it. So the letter is kind of manual for the book of record, and in a way one starts to feel that you're in this mise en abîme-like situation where there's always something that has to survive something else in order to. But I don't know how many extant copies there still are, or actually if there are if they still exist in the Tibetan lamaseries that they were supposed to be sent to. Because it's a kind of curious double bind, the relationship between the capsule and the book of record.
Also, is there a record of how many of these time capsules there are? I mean, so there's these two, but do we know how many? I mean, because you always see these. I mean, at least I see in American films, these kids putting these time capsules in the. Yeah. Do we know how many things are in the ground?
No. I mean, I think. I mean, I suppose there are. It gets difficult. It becomes. They come to proliferate so much that it becomes a little bit difficult to know what is, what's actually acting as a time capsule in the sense, and what isn't. I think probably every primary school in Europe probably has a time capsule buried by the children at one point somewhere in there. But in terms of these sort of really kind of programmatic, microcosmic capsules, I think that's an interesting question. Really where that goes, because I think the problems of definition become more and more, problematic and politically problematic. There are. I mean, I suppose they go through particular. Obviously they go through particular kinds of transformation with the development of different kinds of technologies as well, but also the prospective, prospective possibilities offered by envisionable future technologies. So, for example, in there was a well-publicized court case recently you might have heard about a young girl who died, where there was a battle between the parents about the cryogenic freezing of the body of the child. And this sort of, this is another form of a kind of another imaginary of a technological reanimation, which is linked to sort of kind of contemporary archiving traditions, in this case based around sort of coldness and freezing, but also relies on the kind of survival of an external infrastructure, which is the conditioning infrastructure itself. It plays the role of the book of record in a way, but kind of projected into a future in which it's anticipated that certain kinds of possibilities might exist.
It'd be nice to see how many of these things are. I mean, it would be a good joke if they go and I don't know, whatever year to restore it and I find another one on top of it. By mistake.
Yeah.
Sorry. Liv.
I don't actually have a question, but I just wonder if it is possible to distinguish between, let's say, the phenomena of the seed bank and these time capsules by saying that the seed bank is about survival and biodiversity, while these capsules are not about that kind of, both have the perspective of catastrophe. Survival and biodiversity is another purpose, and I get the impression that the purpose is some sort of communicating with future human beings, the future, some live, living creatures at least, somehow, telling them who we are, letting them know that we exist. That's some sort of communication, while the seed bank is not about communication, it's about survival and biodiversity. Would that be one distinction that could sort of make sense?
Yeah, it could be. It could be, and I see the point of that. But I also think that I think in the minds of the constructors of the time capsule is also about a kind of survival. I mean, this is the sort of point between this sort of strange oscillation of imminent, disappearance and the projection of some kind of remains into the future, but also the sense that the civilization of the present and sort of meaning in the present might be reanimated and might survive in contact with the. And I think that's the. I think it is a kind of survivalist kind of imaginary that's also fueling that. No, but I see the point. I think it's much more specifically determined in the case of the time capsule. But it's I think they're two very interesting cases to think about on one side and another. Yeah.
There's two more.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting debate. I was thinking about looking at it in a bigger picture of different memory cultures in a way. You already mentioned there's an allusion here to the crypt and the tomb, and also André Bazin talks about this. Every culture has their own way of surviving death or sort of survivance, so to speak. But many of the modern types of archives have been linked to national cultures or epochs or quite well-defined cultures in a way. But if you go back to ancient China had this. The way they did the tombs was very much a tomb representing the end of a certain civilization, going back to the first emperors, who collected all the soldiers, Emperor Qi. And also in their old encyclopedia, there were sort of samples of every written document in their civilization. So what I'm asking a little bit is what do you think is the specificity of the transformation of this particular kind of memory culture form of the time capsule? Do you look at it, is it because of the bomb or that particular aspect of it which you think transforms the memory culture in a way? Do you see, if so, do you see similar responses within the general library, archive, heritage, museum culture at the same time? Or is this an isolated sort of more American version of memory culture?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think two major determinants, absolutely are the sense of, certainly the kind of post-nuclear condition, although obviously the first time capsule actually, exists before that. Maybe it's better to say on one hand the kind of technologically driven industrialized warfare on one side, but also the emergent geopolitical antagonisms that are that can animate so much cultural production at the time of the sort of through the 20s and certainly into the 30s. With the sense that, I think it is about this issue of the fracturing of the continuity of cultural memory through lived experience. That there may not be this kind of lineage of endurance, and what comes at the other side of that. Now, does this affect other archives? Yes, I think it does. So something like, if you think something like the collection at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown in maybe is it up in New York State? It's sort of north of New York. Anyway, but the location, this was a kind of major donation of a private collection of artworks. It was specifically located in relationship to kind of an assessment of damage given understanding what the primary targets would be in a nuclear exchange. So the way archives are to be positioned, for example, begin to be related to that. But also, I guess one of the arguments I'm making in the paper is that they also start to take on the cultural forms of these technologies. They begin to look like missiles, or they begin to look like bunkers, and they begin to be constructed as bunkers with a kind of view to being able to kind of withstand or endure the impact or environmental conditions of, and I think also that there's, I have a suspicion that it also becomes, so in the certainly through the 1950s, there comes to be a series of speculations, investigations around what becomes known as bunker ecology, which is the idea that one might be able to make long-time sustainable encapsulated ecologies inside bunkers, inside defensive structures. But it also intersects with speculation at the time about long-term space flight. Space flight that might last for 25 years or something like that into far, and being able to make an encapsulated environment that can be ecologically, there's sort of encapsulated ecology. And the kind of stuff, this comes out through things like Gerard O'Neill's Space Colony project, which Stuart Brand became very enamoured with, and part funded. There's a special issue of the Cleveland Quarterly which examines this, but then it directly feeds into the Biosphere project, and actually Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis has its roots in these bunker ecology speculations. Now, I think that archives become, in terms of the way they, it's no longer about simply creating a conditioned interior, but it might have to be sort of conditioned in the context of a kind of radical degradation of exterior conditions. And I think this kind of this increasingly sort of merges with the understanding of what a kind of properly, defensive, interior might look like in the kind of post-war condition.
Sunni.
Hey. Hello. Thank you for a very nice lecture. I was wondering, just maybe more a comment than a question, that there were some kind of interesting analogies to the book by American author Tom Vanderbilt, and his the book is called Survival Cities, and it's sort of mapping out the differences between on the one side, all the efforts to bring security in terms of the nuclear threats, to bring in ways of living underneath the surface of the earth, and how these sort of large bunkers is kind of got constructed, and at the same time, simultaneously, you have the glass architecture, exhibiting the safeness and the prosperity of life in a kind of very vulnerable situation.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. I don't know the book, but I'll just look at that. So obviously something that I think is is interesting, important to think about there is the this kind of questions about the rights of access. Who's saved in these situations as well? Who are the addressees of the spaces of the protected spaces? And I suppose one thinks a little bit of the sort of the final scene of Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, in which the doomsday machine has been detonated, and we get the kind of flickerings of the sort of bunker utopia in which the political elites get to kind of go underground, especially selected breeding partners, etc., and imagine that they will sort of that there will be kind of repopulation of the planet based on the on the progeny of the. And this is a familiar sort of theme in terms of, many right-wing utopias tend to be projected as kind of post-catastrophic utopias where the catastrophe produces something, has some kind of purging effect that then allows the reconstruction of a kind of society along the kind of ideological lines of the of the promoters. But this sort of constant sort of incommensurability between areas of protection in relationship to areas of exposure, and the kind of in one sense, there's sort of the simple political economy of this is sort of very interesting in the way in which public funds and resources are sequestered in the context of certain, particular catastrophic scenarios, and this sort of, the kind of the determinations that are made through the kinds of emergency planning that are produced under kind of discriminations that are made. In a way, one way to think about that is that it simply reproduces what we already see on the surface, but it does it in a kind of intensified way, I guess.
On that cheerful note, are there any last questions? Shall we thank the speaker? Thank you very much. And the organizers, I wanted to say, but this